If this one keeps you up, hit subscribe and come back to tell us which moment crawled under your skin. Maplewood smelled like fried onions and cut brass that evening, a domestic scent that had nothing to do with the sirens. Rachel stood at the sink, palms in soapy water, and watched the suds tremble as the neighborhood alarm, thin and high like a warning bird, sank into the air. Across the street, Mr. Hargreaves' porch light blinked twice and went out. Kids in yards stopped mid-chase and listened. The town that folded its mailboxes into neat, predictable rows was suddenly a place that could be asked to close its doors. She had tucked the list of emergency contacts into the pocket of Ethan's backpack that morning, the folded paper nearly invisible beneath crayon drawings and a dried sticker. Ethan hummed a half-sung song at breakfast, his spoon hitting the cereal bowl in time with the cadence, an ordinary small percussion that made her think, absurdly, of stability. Then the school text came, lockdown drill, 2 o'clock. A drill, always a drill. Maplewood schools random like teeth on a comb, neat and routine. Rachel believed in routines because they let her pretend that worry could be scheduled and contained. The first crack in containment arrived in the things that should have been harmless. The message on her phone blurred as she hurried into the car. Lockdown extended. Follow district instructions. No explanation. The sirens returned, low now, like someone clearing their throat at the world. Ethan's small hand found hers in the hallway, fingers warm and solid. He asked, bright and blind, "Is it like hide and seek, Mommy?" She forced a smile she did not feel and told him yes, and that was the lie she clung to as the town unfurled into the long, slow motion of panic. They reached the school, and the swarm of parents at the gate looked like gulls, bunched, noisy, discomforted. Teachers stood in doorways with clipboards, eyes darting. A woman sobbed into her sleeve. Rachel's throat ran dry. She wanted to sweep Ethan into her arms and vanish. Instead, she handed him off to his classroom, watched him disappear through the glass with his little backpack hooked over one shoulder like a promise. The class door clicked shut. For a moment, the school was a painting. Bright lockers, shrieks of children's laughter stored in memory like candy. Then the building exhaled a long, uneasy breath. The first story, the one that hung in the hospital waiting room later as rumor and cold coffee, started with a janitor who liked to whistle. He was clean-cut, an ordinary man with a cloth over his shoulder and a keyring that jangled like coins when he walked. Someone saw him in the hallway after the lockdown began, a single figure sweeping with a rhythm that turned between methodical and mechanical. The first story, the one that hung in the hospital waiting room later as rumor and cold coffee, started with a janitor who liked to whistle. He was clean-cut, an ordinary man with a cloth over his shoulder and a keyring that jangled like coins when he walked. Someone saw him in the hallway after the lockdown began, a single figure sweeping with a rhythm that turned between methodical and mechanical. He was masked, those surgical masks that made his voice flat, and he hummed a tune that sounded like a nursery rhyme gone wrong. Each note bent just enough to make listeners tilt their heads. Rachel thought of that man when she heard the first strange transmission over the school intercom. It was not a voice she recognized. The announcement system cracked and fizzed, then a sound, like a distant radio washed with children playing. The voice that came through was sing-song, high and slender, as though a child had been curled inside a throat not meant for them. "Hush, hush," it said, and the PA system fed the word into every emptied classroom. The sound was thin, like paper scraping against paper. Somewhere down the hall a locker slammed, and for a heartbeat everyone thought it was the wind. Doors latched. Lights switched to emergency modes, blinking fluorescence throwing everything into intervals of day and night. Rachel watched Ethan through the glass and saw him mimic the rhythm with his legs, feet tapping like a small hammer against the linoleum. He did not look afraid. He looked curious, which was worse. Curiosity meant he would move toward sound, toward answers, toward whatever was singing. They said later the janitor's trolley had been found abandoned in the boys' bathroom, mops standing like an accusation. There were no footprints leading away. The custodial closet was locked from the inside. No one saw him leave. No one claimed to have entered. The camera over the stairbill had a smear on it, like the residue of breath on glass. When police finally looped the security footage, the image jittered and skipped at the moment the figure passed, as if something had passed through the recording itself. The janitor existed in the school's memory only as the trace of a tune and the cold arc of a shadow on tile. Rachel felt the school's bones in that shape, the way a hallway could swallow sound and pinch light to the width of a pen. In the afternoons, kids' laughter spilled like confetti through those corridors. Now it returned in strips, the same thin, repeating clip on the PA system, fragmentary and looped. Teachers pressed their faces against doors, listening. A child in first grade cried until a teacher covered his mouth with a clean hand. The laughter slipped under that hand like water. Rachel knew, without being told, that the meetings of adults in the office were not just about safety protocols. There was a language of looks, open palms, closed mouths, that meant something had intruded into what they had once named secure. The second thing that grew teeth in Maplewood was the mirror room. No place in school should have a mirror room. But the art department had installed a practice studio for theater classes, floor-to-ceiling panes where students rehearsed faces and expressions. The mirrors had been meant for study. In the dark, they became windows. Someone said that during the lockdown, a child had wandered toward the mirror and, reaching for his own reflection, found another hand reach back. Rachel could still see Ethan's tiny reflection in a shop window once, a day earlier. His forehead crowned by late sunlight, his mouth an open O at something only he could see. Mothers carry such images like currency. They spend memories to pay for courage. Rachel spent them now, reckoning with the possibility of glass that did not return a true face. When they forced the theater door open 2 hours into the first incident, they found rows of tiny shoes lined up before the mirrors as if in worship. The shoes were small, neat, some glittering with forgotten stickers, but the children were gone. In the reflected world behind the glass, the room seemed deeper, an echo made of space. Teachers staring into the mirror felt the temperature drop, the lights above, already stuttering, faintly humming with a note that made the metal chairs vibrate. Some swore they saw, in the mirrors, their own faces delayed by a beat, mouths moving out of sync like puppets. A teacher reached in to touch the mirror, as if to find where glass ended and air began. Her fingers met a surface that tasted like the inside of a throat, warm and slick, and then recoiled as a pressure from the other side pressed back. It was not the weight of a hand, but of a living insistence. The handprint she left on the cold was blurred, as though smeared by a breath. The child who had first approached the mirror was later found in the nurse's office, eyes like smoked glass, whispering a melody that did not belong to his mouth. He refused to say where he had been. When he finally did, his words were a muddle of names that were not names. "Toss, toss, wheel," he said, and then clapped, and the words sounded like the lock on Rachel's chest twisting. Rachel kept returning in her head to the laugh. It was a sound that had begun as a motif, a small thread of audio that took on the texture of a warning. Laughter, the kind that children make when they are untroubled, became the cipher. In the third incident, it was the swing set that spoke through that cipher. The playground merry-go-round, paint chipped, bolts rusted, was made to spin by small hands. During the lockdown, someone had set it moving. Parents saw from across the lot, the circle turning, an impossible speed for those small palms. The metal wheel hummed, a harmonics of motion that threw light in circular slashes. Children's voices layered over the sound, multi-tracked, as if a room full of tiny mouths had been recorded and run through the school soundboard. The circular field of motion created a smell,
Ozone, hot metal, the sour tang of sweat. And at its center, the shadow pulled like ink. A boy named Jamie had been found perched atop the carousel, legs dangling, hair stuck with static, eyes unfocused. He babbled about being part of the round, about hearing someone call his name from under.
He insisted he could see beyond the playground, fields folding into spirals where the horizon curled like a curtain. He would not look at his mother when she asked him what game they had been playing. Later, in the hospital corridor, Jamie hugged his knees and watched the floor tiles with the intensity of a man trying to solve a code only he knew. Rachel followed his stare and felt enough vertigo to sit down, as if the gymnasium tiles themselves might peel up and reveal an underside of night. Rachel began to notice small conjurations at home, things that should have meant nothing and now felt portent. The little spinning top Ethan favored rolled slightly on the counter as if nudged by an invisible finger. The radio in the kitchen fuzzed at the precise moment she dialed to check messages, and through the static she caught a syllable of the nursery rhyme from the janitor song. It was never complete. It arrived like a memory someone had dipped in water, blurred edges, the center missing. She taped the lid of the blender and left it running as if the normal hum of appliances might stitch a seam against intrusion. The fourth story gathered itself in the gymnasium, where emergency lights cast everything in a jaundiced half-life. The gym was supposed to be the place of shelter, bodies pressed into dark corners, hands over mouths, breath held like coins in a fist. Instead, someone had turned the bleachers into a stage. There were drawings on the floor, chalked in childish hands, circles and lines that made a pattern no name could claim. The pattern pulsed with an awful symmetry, and within it the air shimmered as if heat pressed breath into ribbons. Rachel found Ethan clinging to a teacher, knees wrapped around the woman's waist like a burr. He had mucus crusting at his lip, his hair stuck in a fringe where someone had run a damp hand through it. He had been collected by a line of teachers shepherding students into one room for accounting. Heads counted, fingers checked. When the final count came, there was a child missing from a different class, and someone in the school office said, voice shaking, he wasn't in his classroom. The word missing slid into the conversation like ice into a drink, and every mouth drank. The person they called the mask, that figure with a face hidden by something that made the features flat, appeared in reports from students who had seen light move where no light should be. They described a figure that watched from a doorway, head inclined like a curious child. It would sometimes tap on glass, they said, tapping in a rhythm that mimicked the heart. If the voice came through intercoms or if it came from down the hall, it never sounded the same twice. The mask's voice borrowed from children's patterns, sing-song, lilted, coaxing. It promised games, candies, secret doors. It sounded like everything a child might want and everything a parent would flinch to imagine. On the night that the gym filled with patterns, someone opened the doors to the fire lane to look for fresh air and found the asphalt slicked in a dark film that smelled of wet earth and old coins. Footprints appeared in that film, small shoe-shaped indentations that began at the edge of the asphalt and stopped at the school wall, as if the ground itself had decided not to hold them anymore. The prints were empty of detail. They were mere silhouettes, like shadows pressed into mud. Rachel moved through the school like someone threading her way through a dream's memory. She could smell meatloaf as though it emanated from some other life she scarcely recognized, a domestic ghost. She thought of the ordinary things that make up mothers, a thermometer in a drawer, a jacket hanging over a chair, the soft weight of a child asleep against a shoulder. Those things sharpened in her mind and became talismans she could not quite carry into the school with her, but that she held on to with the force of a prayer. She found Ethan at the edge of the cafeteria, where children had been gathered and given water and grilled cheese. He came to her the way a small animal comes to someone who has, in a single motion, become a safe place.
He leaned into her and whispered, so quiet she had to peel his words out of the fabric of the noise. "They sing to the mirrors, Mommy. They're lonely." He smelled of crayons and the after sweat of play. His voice had the surety of belief, childhood language converted into certainty. The fifth and most unmooring of the lockdown stories happened in the nurse's office and then bled outward like a stain. The windows there were curtained, sunlight thin as gauze. A girl named Lila had been found behind the desk, hands on the countertop as if she were steadying herself against something. Her lips moved, and from them came no words at first, only the repetition of a single syllable that had caught in the nurse's throat when she first heard it. Lila's eyes rolled white for a second, then they fixed on Rachel with a clarity that made the air change. "It looks like them," Lila mouthed, and pointed toward the mirror that hung crooked above the nurse's cot. She said the phrase as though it were a fact of science. "It wants to wear faces." They began to piece together the rules. The mirror wanted to copy. It wanted to be looked into, as though looking were the coin with which it paid its hunger. It lured by offering not what was lost, but what was remembered. A cheerful childhood, a missing hand, a voice that mimicked, with terrible fidelity, the sound of home. Once someone looked too long, something on the other side began to furnish itself with borrowed skin. Mothers described small alterations in their children after the incidents: an extra tilt of head, a smile held one breath too long, a preference for places that were not safe. Rachel's maternal armor hardened into something more direct the night she refused to step back.
They were evacuating a group of children when a masked figure blocked the corridor. Not fully formed, a silhouette accentuated by the intermittent hallway lights. The mask's head cocked, and from the folds of its covering came a laugh that rippled like bells. It was a sound that tried on joy and made it monstrous. It moved toward the line of children with the polite, measured gait of an actor approaching a mark. Rachel stepped forward. Her body remembered the reflexes of a mother, to put herself between danger and her child, to make herself the barrier. Her hands were steady even as the blood in her ears pounded. She spoke, voice taut and unmodulated. "You don't get him," she said. The sentence was simple, like a shelf upon which she set all her will. The mask tilted its head, and, for a second, Rachel thought it might retreat. Then it bent and, with a motion that was almost gentle, reached toward Ethan. The hand that emerged from the mask was not a hand so much as the suggestion of one, an absence carved into shape. It had the texture of cold paper and smelled faintly of the ozone from the merry-go-round and the iron tang of the gym. Rachel's skin crawled at the contact of that air. She lunged. There is a thing mothers do in crisis, movement that makes no calculation past the one need to remove peril. She grabbed Ethan and pulled him back where her arms were a live thing wrapped around his torso. She felt, for a breath, the tug as if someone on the other side had tried to take him through the fabric of the world. His tiny shoulder blades scraped under her palms. Ethan whimpered, part surprised, part frightened. The mask recoiled with a sound like fabric torn. It had been repelled not by weapon nor by competence, but by the body that refused to yield its child. There was a small slot, an almost gap in the boundaries they had felt, through which the mask tried to push its will, and Rachel jammed herself into that slot and refused to move. The theater lights overhead flared and then steadied into their emergency blank. The laughter faded to the soft, maddening cadence of someone turning a page. No one could say precisely how the tide turned. Teachers, parents, whoever had the courage in those minutes, moved, legs as quick as whispers, and closed ranks around children. Some slammed doors. Someone turned the gym lights up high, and light, it appeared, had a kind of antiseptic effect, as though the shadow that prowled preferred the uneven, the flicker, the intervals where darkness could slip in. Dazzled, the mask withdrew, retreating into places light could not reach.
It left the school like smoke withdrawing through a crack, visible but without shape. They carried children out into the night in arms, in wheelchairs, propped on shoulders. Sirens shouted. Neighbors emerged in pajamas, faces raw with the floral print of sleep. The world poured onto the grass in a slow, astonished river.
Rachel kept Ethan against her chest, his weight forward, his breath against her collarbone. He said almost nothing. Once, in a voice like a small, clanging bell, he asked, "Did the mirror get jealous because it couldn't have me?" Rachel wanted to laugh and wanted to scream. She simply kissed the crown of his head and told him they were safe now. And a stranger in the crowd heard and drew in her breath as if it were the first truthful thing spoken that night. They took statements, and Kevin from the district did the best he could with the board's checklist, but protocol had not been written for things that returned faces instead of names. They taped off the theater and the playground and the gym. They covered the mirrors with sheets like bodies at rest. The town tried to rename what had happened so it would fit into the shape of sentences they could bear. Anomalous events, one superintendent called them, in a message that made Rachel's jaw ache. Parents posted on neighborhood groups photos of chalked circles, of small shoes lined up like footprints in a prayer. People offered theories: gas leaks, mass hysteria, a prank. Theories are a way of breathing. But even with explanations spoken, a residue remained. Children who had been in the rooms with mirrors sometimes blinked slowly at dusk, watching surfaces with a hunger that made mothers' stomachs twist. Some awoke giggling, as if the veil between a dream and waking had been rent too thin. Rachel found herself inspecting reflections in spoonbacks during dishes, testing whether they moved in step with her. Ethan started to prefer dim hallways and would sometimes stop by windows and press his small forehead to the glass as if listening for something on the other side. And then, weeks after the school had been sutured back into some semblance of order, there was the photograph. It arrived in an email forwarded through friends and small-town listservs, a grainy shot of a fundraising event in the school cafeteria. At the back of the picture, near the baked goods, someone had captured an arrangement of children laughing around a table. A child's face in the mirrored wall behind them was slightly longer than the others, small eyes too wide and set too far apart. It smiled with a precision that would become sickness in the stomach. Rachel stared until the image blurred, until the laugh inside the photo sounded in her mind, and she realized she could hear it as if it were threaded through the town static. After that, the idea of silence became suspect. Silence could be the calm before some imitation of play. The town started to keep radios low and to check in with neighbors more frequently, as though conversation might soothe the edges of whatever lay against them. Rachel kept the kitchen light on all night, an old habit in a modern worry. She would wake at 3 a.m. with the impression of movement in the bedroom's dark and think for a second that the mirror across from Ethan's bed had shifted. It had not. Still, she would cross the room and lay her palm against the glass, feeling nothing more than the dependable chill of reflection. And each time she felt the same small, ridiculous urge to ground, to find proof that what stood on the other side was nothing but her own face. Families moved children between rooms and closets, rearranged beds to face doors, started sleeping with phones clenched like talismans. Yet the mask respected none of those rituals. It watched routines and learned where they thinned. It listened to scripts and found the unwritten lines. The fifth incident, the one that made Rachel know that whatever had visited them did not abide by ordinary laws, involved a little boy named Mateo who had disappeared into the school's old basement for a game of hide-and-seek. Mateo was an only child who liked to hide behind curtains and pretend to be a ghost. Later, his mother would say with the tremor of someone who had had her life rearranged, he was built of hiding. For a child like that, the spaces beneath buildings were a map of worlds. He was found 3 blocks from the school the next morning, sitting on a stoop with his shoes on the wrong feet and humming as if content.
He would not look at the adults who had been frantic enough to search for him through the night. When a policeman asked, gently, because his voice insisted on being gentle even when the words could not bear it, where he had been, Mateo pointed at his own throat and hummed a note that was wrong in its contour. He spoke one sentence that stuck everyone's gut, so small but arranged like a key. They said the outside is the other inside. They tried to patch the truth together then, in the way people stitch torn fabric. Testimony threaded with the common need to make mended meaning. Some said the thing used the school's infrastructure, ventilation shafts, wiring, light shafts, to travel. Others posited the more terrifying idea that what hovered did not move physically but moved attention, a contagion of glance that could make a child step to a place they should not. Rachel lay awake and pictured corridors turning inward, rooms folding like paper into smaller rooms. She tried to imagine an architecture that had no rules and felt suddenly as if she lived in the margin of a book. 2 nights after Mateo's return, Rachel woke to find Ethan at the foot of her bed, eyes glassy and dark in the bedroom light. He had snuck in somehow, silent as a cat, his small shoulders shaking less from cold than from some repressed and freshly spent movement. He held in his hands a toy he had not owned in weeks, a small plastic mirror from a party favor, and he kept flipping it open and shut. When she asked him what he was doing, he said, "The mirror likes me because I listen." She could have taken the mirror away. She could have handed it to the sink and smashed it under the weight of a measurable decision. The thought rose in her like an air-formed shape and then dissipated because Rachel knew that the thing that had crept into mirrors did not require a surface to live anymore. It thrived on being recognized. The more they clung to proof, the more likely they were to give it a foothold. Instead, Rachel sat up and wrapped the blanket around Ethan and told him that listening was for songs and for voices that said your name with love, not for the hollow holler that sounded like his friends but was not. He looked at her as if cataloging the difference and then, after a long breath, settled into sleep. The town tried rituals of its own. Parents stood at school gates at dawn and recited names. Teachers lit candles in classrooms and forbade mirrors. A pastor down Maplewood Way read scripture into a church's loudspeaker until the words wore thin like fabric. None of that stopped the small private incidents. People continued to dream of being watched in glass, of seeing their faces turn into someone else's. Animals reacted differently. Dogs refused to go near certain rooms, and a cat would not cross the line where mirrors stood. Nature, in its small ways, remarked differently on the world shaken from its axis. For Rachel, the work of mothering became the work of translation. She learned the rhythms that meant danger and the ones that meant nothing. She learned to parse laughter. She learned Ethan's pauses the way linguists learn dialect. Once, in the grocery store, Ethan watched a child videotaping himself with a phone and laughed at the screen as the boy mimicked a teacher's phrase. Rachel watched him and felt an ache like an alarm. She took him by the hand and left the aisle. The child's mother said something, apologetic and hurried, and Rachel nodded as if she understood all the small culpabilities mothers held and let them fall away into the trolley's hum. The nights after the lockdowns wore down like rope. In daylight, the school reopened with a longer shadow cast at noon. They painted over the chalk drawings with whitewash, as if to bring blankness back. The mirror room gathered dust, then a sheet, then a plate of flowers by the door, because someone thought offerings might appease. But at dusk, the town flinched at the sound of a late laugh from someone's porch, and all through Maplewood, the mothers kept one ear trained to the wind. Months later, in a quiet and brittle sort of spring, Rachel watched Ethan at a friend's birthday party where the kids were allowed to run wild in a park with a rickety old merry-go-round. He pushed at it with both hands, laughter spilling out, and when he hopped on for a turn, his smile, just for a fraction, stilled. The spin took him. For an instant, she saw again the carousel image from the school, the center dark and shimmering, and the air compressed into a single hard moment. Then he leaned forward and slid off, cheeks flushed, impatient for the next ride. He seemed fine. He was fine. Rachel tried to let that be enough.
But the lingering thing existed in the twitch of his left eye when he laughed too hard. In the way sometimes he would stop mid-sentence and stare at his spoon as if it reflected a man he ought to remember. He started once to hum that thin rhythm in the pantry while pouring cereal. Rachel sat down on the bottom stair and let the wound of knowing open inside her. It hurt in a concentrated metallic line. She kept him close, and when she tucked him in, she left the door ajar and read until the words blurred. She watched the mirror across the room and thought about how many mothers of other towns might be doing the same, testing each new glint for evidence, for betrayal, for mercy. One morning, weeks after the last official statement, the town posted a notice. An unattended mirror had been found by the riverbank, one of those cheap decorative kinds with a gilt edge. Someone had knocked it over and left it face down in the mud. People speculated nervously. Had it been trying to flee? Had it been dumped? The roamer pressed at the margins of sobriety and turned into an ugly rumor. Mirrors moved when left alone. Rachel went down to the river, drawn by a force that might have been morbid curiosity or something else, an attraction to the story that had taken root in her life, and saw, half buried, the glass reflecting nothing but the peeled sky. She did not touch it. She left a small stone on its rim instead, a monument to not knowing. The final small escalation that lived in her memory like a shiver happened on a night when it rained. The wind made the windows sing. Ethan, who had begun sleeping without interruption the way a child resettles after shallow hurt, stood in the doorway of her room and watched her sleep. He did not call. He did not move his lips. Rachel woke with the sense of something at the edge of the world, a whisper that had the cadence of a name. She drew him into the bed and found his forehead damp. He wrapped his arm around her and murmured, "If you listen, sometimes they get bored." She pressed her cheek to the crown of his head and promised herself the truest thing she could produce in that instant. That she would listen, but she would not grant entrance. She would be the barrier. After the night passed, she drove to the school without waking Ethan, because mothers sometimes are the kind of people who needed to look with their own eyes and not trust second-hand story. The school gates were empty in the rain, puddles displacing streetlights into pieces. The building looked like any other building you had ever known in a storm, solid, harmless, and hosting inside of it the possibility that everywhere danger had been politely rewired. Rachel walked the perimeter. Her hands were wet and cold. When she peered into the theater windows, the mirrors were covered with plastic sheeting. The gym's pattern had been painted over, the chalk erased. The playground stood dull and folded like a thing waiting for sunlight. For a moment, she felt foolish, the way someone feels when they return to a place to learn that fear had been a guest and had left without leaving a note. Then, on the back wall, beneath a line of peeling paint, someone had written a message in that cramped, childish script she had seen in the chalk drawings. It was not large. It was not meant for adults' eyes. It said, "Thank you for keeping the lights." She could not decide whether the message was meant as gratitude or as mockery. The town had reinstalled mirrors in some of the rooms after months of intervention. They had been required for tests, for rehearsals, for art. Rachel understood that society is a fabric that cannot be fully cored out of its own necessities. You cannot simply remove all surfaces. She thought of her reflection in car windows, in spoons, in the shop glass, and the small private act of looking into them and shaping her face into something recognizable for Ethan. She came home with the taste of rain still in her mouth, and the tiredness of someone who had spent too long convincing herself of safety. Ethan woke while she was at the doorway and smiled the cricket smile of someone who knows more than one joke. He climbed into her lap and, without preface, asked, "Do they ever get lonely on the other side?" He spoke with the plainness of a child seeking information.
Rachel held him tighter and answered, in the softened language of someone trying to make sense, "Maybe, but loneliness doesn't get you back, not if we hold on." He nodded and then, as if thinking of something else, handed her the little plastic mirror. For a second, she weighed what to do. Smash it, bury it, give it back. She turned it over and saw her own face, sleepless, a little hollow under the eyes, but firm. She placed the mirror on the shelf and, in a ritual she invented, she put a strip of tape over the polished surface. Not to hide it, not to pretend it did not exist, but to mark the place where her reflection could be checked and then dismissed. Outside, the town resumed its rhythm. Children went back to school with backpacks and lunchboxes. Parents traded looks that were both a comfort and a verification. You were still here. The mask receded into the lexicon of fear and rumor and was not seen again in the full sense of that word. But the town learned to bend its habits. Mirrors were checked before being purchased. Playgrounds were watched through a new lens. The laughter that once had been harmless now arrived threaded with a question mark. People would later tell the story of Maplewood as if it were a parable, a cautionary tale about attentiveness, about the thin line between safe and unsafe, about the way childhood wonder can be imitated by danger that speaks a similar tongue. But for Rachel, the story lived in the small, private details. The way Ethan sometimes paused at reflective surfaces, the way he still sometimes hummed a tune in the pantry, the way he slept with his distant arm flung over an empty pillow, as if to keep something from lying there. She did not like the way she sometimes watched headlights and thought of shapes passing through glass. One night, months later, as she turned out the kitchen light and slid into bed, Rachel heard, faint and at the edge of hearing, the single soft sound that had threaded through everything from janitor whistling to lullaby on the PA. A small, precise laugh, located not in the rooms but in the house's framework itself, like an echo hidden behind the walls. She froze, listening, breath shallow. Ethan turned in the night and murmured something indistinct. She put a hand on his back and felt his steady rise and fall, measured and human. In the dark, she whispered, not an invocation, not a surrender, but a promise. Not you, not tonight. The word was hers alone, flung into a night that had all the possibility of both ordinary continuation and sudden, uncanny return. For a long time, nothing answered but the slow domestic hum of pipes. Then, perhaps because she was willing to admit fear out loud, the house settled. The laugh did not come again. Still, in the morning, he went to school, as all small things must, and she watched him walk away with that backpack over one shoulder, a small animate thing bearing the trace of home. She held to the idea that rescue had happened, that the decisive act, her arm's refusal to relinquish him in the corridor, had been the fulcrum that tipped the night back toward safety. She also held the other truth, quieter and more insistent, that something had learned the town by name. It had found appetites in mirror and laughter and the cadence of a PA system. It had been rebuffed, not erased. In the months that followed, Rachel kept a list in her phone of the small rituals that held them. Unplugging certain speakers, covering a specific mirror with a cloth after sunset, always leaving a hall light on. She would not call them superstitions, because superstition implies a cruelty of the mind that invents solace where none exists. These were practices born from necessity and repeated because repetition is a kind of armor. She taught Ethan gently to name the difference between a laugh that was his friend and a laugh that was pretending. He learned quickly. Children are quick to learn what keeps them safe. On an afternoon when the sky was clear and blue like a thin, honest promise, Rachel walked past the river where the gilt-framed mirror had been found. The bank was clean. The weeds had pushed away the impression of disturbed earth. She thought of the 5 stories she had learned to carry: the janitor's tune, the mirror's hand, the merry-go-round spin, the gem's pattern, the little boy who came back with the outside folded into him. They sat in her chest like small stones whose placement had altered the slope of her life.
She bent down and, without thinking, picked up a pebble and held it. It was smooth as any pebble. She turned it over and found, underneath, a faint scratch that made a shape like a small curl. It could have been anything: a chip, a flaw, a random score. In the way minds make patterns of accident, she read in it the shape of a smile that might be childlike, might be something else. She felt the old reflex to tell herself a story that would end with safety and order. Instead, she folded the pebble into the pocket of her jeans and walked home. At night, she would sometimes wake with the image of a face in the dark, a face not cruel, not kind, but precise. It was not the face of the mask, but a composite of reflections. A child's grin threaded across an adult's jaw. She would listen for the laugh as if it were a weather sign, and then, when it did not come, ease back into sleep. There was a chastening comfort in the absence of sound, the way an empty house may be more merciful than one that keeps unexpected hours. Rachel never stopped checking mirrors. She never stopped listening. She never stopped holding Ethan just a little longer when he needed it. She learned to be vigilant with the tenderness of someone who knows what is at stake. And whenever someone in Maplewood told the tale, they told it with the same slight tilt, a warning and a balm, a record of fear and of a stubborn, ordinary bravery. The town had been changed, not by any monstrous rewrite of its days, but by a lesson in attentiveness that wrapped around everyone like a new habit. Sometimes, in late spring, when sunlight cut the school's playground in perfect halves, a child would laugh in a manner that made Rachel's stomach clench. She would watch the turning of a carousel, the quick shadow of a hand against metal, and then breathe out and let the scene play out. Mostly, they were just children at play. Mostly, laughter was laughter, and mirrors were only glass. Mostly. But she never quite believed in mostly the way she once had. Months later, years perhaps in the small telescoping sense of memory, Ethan would, on a rare clear evening, stop and look back at the school where he had once been shepherded through darkness. He would stand at the chain-link fence and watch the combined motion of playground and light, and then look down at his hands with that particular pause, the one that says the world is both larger and stranger than the story adults give it. He would then, in a voice that was his alone, hum the small thread the way one hums a tune to remember the measure of things. Rachel would watch him and feel both the cold prick of fear and a warmth like a strand of light. She would not say anything. She would only keep her hand on his shoulder and let the silence between them do its work. If anything returned to Maplewood, it did so like a rumor, an unaccounted laugh at a bake sale, a reflection that stayed too long in the window of a diner. But threats in Maplewood had learned the one thing that could stop them more often than anything else: the presence of parents who would meet them and refuse to hand over what was theirs. Rachel became one of those presences, someone who learned to hold the line between curiosity and caution, who learned the language of the small signals that whispered of danger. She never stopped wondering, though, in the private and more complicated way of people who have seen edge cases of the world, whether their resistance had taught the thing to be craftier, whether in refusing it she had trained it to seek other doors. The idea made her careful in a new way. She taught Ethan to knock 3 times before opening a door that was shut. She taught him to call out names when someone knocked at odd hours. They practiced such tiny rituals the way soldiers might practice a drill. On certain evenings, the house still hummed with the small echoes of that first lockdown. A song on a TV muffled by static, a squeak of the swing, an old whistle. When she closed her eyes, Rachel could, if she let herself, trace the route again from the janitor's trolley to the theater to the gym to the river. She could tell the story in order and break it up into 5 neat segments, as the title might promise. 5 chilling lockdown stories that would haunt anyone who listened. But the truth was less neat. The stories braided together into one long thread that ran through the town and through her life. A single cord tied by and untying at the knots of ordinary days. She learned to live with knots.
Even now, sometimes, late and alone, she would catch a motion in the mirror she had tape over. The faintest of reflections, not of form but of intention. And she would think of the mask's gentle reaching and of the child's small voice saying the outside is the other inside. She would think of the theater's chairs and the way light could be an answer. She would think of the single decisive moment when she had not let go. And she would remember the promise she had spoken in the night, that small human invocation. Not you, not tonight, not mine. The whisper at the edge of thought never gave up completely. It lived in the small pauses in laughter and the way a child might sometimes stop mid-play and listen. It had been blunted, yes, but not erased. Rachel kept watch in the way anyone keeps watch after trouble. The routine of caution folded into daily acts, a mother's constant patient vigilance. It was, she knew, enough for now. For now. She learned, in the slow way of weather and bone, how to let small certainties gather until they became livable. The kettle that always sang at 6, the neighbor's porch light that came on without fail, the sound of Ethan's shoelaces when he ran.
Those were not proofs against the old dark. They were reasons to rise in the morning anyway. Spring folded into a summer that smelled of cut grass and lemon soap. Maplewood kept its ordinary politics of mower blades and PTA lists, and in the margins of those ordinary things, lives mended in ways that did not require ceremony. Rachel found herself smiling at the unremarkable bravery of other parents. How they brought cookies to bake sales. How they let their children learn to wobble and fall and stand. It was not a triumph she could catalog. It was more like a gradual retuning of the heart. One evening, when the light was the color of a half-remembered photograph, Ethan came to the kitchen with a paper folded into a crude airplane. He launched it across the room. It curved once, then hit the rim of the sink and fluttered to the floor. He laughed, true, untethered, and Rachel felt the old tightness in her chest ease, as if someone had loosened a knot. She knelt and smoothed his hair and said nothing about the constraint of doors and knocks and mirrors. He was learning, as children do, how to be brave without knowing the word. There were things she still checked before bed. The latch, the porch light, the tape on the old mirror. She did them because rituals shape safety as much as locks do. But she also began quietly to unstick the tape, from one corner, then another, until the glass yielded. She looked at herself for a long time, a woman with a small, steady face, a scattering of laugh lines she had earned, a hand that had kept a boy from falling. She let the reflection be just a reflection. Across town, the carousel still turned, indifferent to any one life. Children shouted, shadows sliced the pavement. Someone dropped a coin and another child picked it up and ran. Maplewood, stitched imperfectly, went on. The mask's rumor slackened into a pattern that no longer ruled the edges of their days. It might return someday, fear had that stubborn elasticity, but for now Rachel held to the vow she had spoken in the dark. Not you, not tonight, not mine. She set the kettle to boil, and the sound, small and domestic, filled the kitchen like an answer.